Okay, but I think at the same time, Vietnamese authorities are expanding cooperation with Japan and India, right? There has been a visit, I think in July. The Minister of Defense, Indian minister, visited Vietnam, and they also signed a cooperation agreement transfer deal with Japan. So it seems like they're slowly expanding its foreign cooperation with regards to military, right?
Well, they're expanding, but again, the historic context.
Yes.
As Vietnam opened up to the outside world and decided it could form relations with all country, its vehicle, its mechanism was an agreement on strategic partnership, and it started with Russia. Then it went to Japan, India, China,
Yes.
and now they have 17. The last inclusions were New Zealand and Australia, but it includes Germany and France, but not the United States, which is a comprehensive partner. And then over the course of time, each one of these has had a word put in front of it, comprehensive strategic partner and comprehensive cooperative strategic partner for China at the high end, or enlarged strategic partnership, whatever. So the process that you're describing has been ongoing for some time. And every now and then, when it's upgraded, new words, these are broad-based partnerships that include defense and security, of course, but political, diplomatic, science, education, sports, tourism, people to people, and in the US, comprehensive human rights, for example. And so, in other words, the way I like to put it, Vietnam, it puts itself obviously at the center of its own universe, and it has all these 17 strategic partners. They offer each one equity in Vietnam, equity in a very broad term, not just economic, but political, diplomatic. Invest in Vietnam, work with Vietnam, cooperate with Vietnam. Why? Because Vietnam promises never to align with one country against a third party, and that's one of its 4 no's.
Yes, yes.
And it has played such a positive role regionally. And to make my point, twice it was the unanimous choice of the 50-odd member Asia bloc at the UN to serve as a non-permanent member of the Security Council. And that's twice within the last decade. And that is exceptional for a country. So Vietnam uses its prestige. It uses the fact that everybody can count on it to be an independent actor that generally supports the international order, international law, as a country likes it. So China sees it's not going to ally with the US. So that's a positive thing. And Vietnam leverages on that. So that's and in the defense area, they believe in self-reliance. And so, but they can pick and choose. Now that you have the sanctions post-Crimea that I mentioned, CATSA, countering American adversaries, and the current sanctions, Vietnam finds it all the more imperative to increase. India's great. It knows Russian weapons. It buys them. It has that experience for the aircraft, for the ships, etc. And then for Japan, air defense is one of the strong forces that Vietnam is working with. And air defense is purely that. It's defending Vietnam's airspace. So that kind of deters any would-be adversary. And as the United States would know from the air war over Vietnam from 1965 to 72, Vietnam was pretty good at defending its airspace.
Okay, but it also cooperates with Israel, Ukraine, Belarus, and Republic of Korea. So it seems like they really expand their cooperation a lot. It's not only the neighbors, but it's also further away. Yes?
Yes, well, I did a recent study from 1995 to the present. Vietnam purchased weapons, military technology, etc., from 27 countries. And the ones that you mentioned are among the top 6. 80-odd% of that, though, from 95 to 2021, comes from Russia. Then you had Belarus and Ukraine, and it's because Russia sold frigates to Vietnam, and back then, when Ukraine wasn't the enemy, they made the engines, and so they got the engines from Ukraine to fit the Gepard-class frigates. Belarus, obviously, because it has a similar familiarity with Russian,
Yes.
was part So it produces that. And South Korea is a new development. Israel, in particular, on drones and other technology. But the amount of but all those countries, other than Russia, up until this market drop, have not been as every year from 1995 onwards. Russia has been the major provider, even when the South Korea. The United States has stepped into that picture, but with Scan Eagle drones and gifting Hamilton class cutters from the Coast Guard, which are being retired. But so yes, Vietnam will, but then that creates a problem of mixing and matching, try to get my English right, of equipment. And that's particularly the case with Israeli equipment and coastal radar and coastal missile defense. They have to plug it in together and make it work. But yes, it's some people have written that Vietnam is being weaned off the Russia. I don't think that's the case. Vietnam has always shopped in the market, and if they find among the 27 partners are Spain, and they get aircraft for maritime surveillance. So not a offensive weapon, but they found that was the best buy for its forces. But so the top six are the ones that you've listed, Russia so far. And as we wait for the post-COVID economic recovery, Vietnam has got some tough choices to make to keep up its modernization.
Okay, but so it diversifies with this regard. But I think the reason why they do that is just to protect themselves, or let's say to have a leverage with regards to China. So that's the one problem, that the issue they have. That's why they are buying so many armaments, right? It's because of the conflicts with China, or is there any other reason?
Right. Well, yes, but what I failed to mention in that, though, is Vietnam is pushing very strongly, as it has, for co-production and technology transfer, so that it's heavily involved, and it's got the platforms from Russia. And if we look at the war in Ukraine, what do we see? Lots of high fire. So Vietnam is producing anti-ship missiles. It's producing ship-to-ship missiles, ground-to-air missiles, air-to-air missiles, so it can have enough stocks. And we could say, yes, I mean, because you do your defense planning on capability and intent, and who has the capability to attack and really overpower you? And in that region, can only be China. China, we can argue about the intent and leave that on the side, but it's prudent. It's self-reliance, and as Vietnam say, for defense, and it's clear. They can. Why have Kilo class submarines in the South China Sea? You're not going to go to war with the U.S. Navy. So you're right, but they don't. But they will never come out forcefully or publicly and say China is the adversary. And I was talking about that debate that some top officials were saying we used to talk about opponents and partners of cooperation, and now we don't know whether opponent or adversary or how else to describe a country that's not entirely supportive of Vietnam and that creates some problems for us.
Yes, and just to finish this topic, I think, yes, what you mentioned, the Vietnamese authorities, they try to involve other countries because there is this military transfer deal with Japan, and they also want closer cooperation with India. For example, they have a logistics agreement, and both militaries can use each other's bases, right? So they won't really get other countries involved and cooperate with them, have a stake in it.
Yes, but again, with Vietnam, if we speak in English and talk about military exercises, that seems pretty benign. But Vietnam makes a distinction in its own language between military exercises that have combat skills, training for war, and military exercises that are just done to improve skills. And they won't cooperate in the former. And so, being a former soccer referee, Vietnam is a country that likes to believe it has it's good at playing a sport. This is my analogy, but they've never done it with the big leagues. And so one of the problems is, as you look at what Vietnam acquires, how will they really go if they make the World Cup, for example. Now we put that back on the military side. They're willing to cooperate with countries, but they won't really get into these warfighting exercises or anti-submarine exercises. And just recently this year, they called off a visit by the USS Ronald Reagan aircraft carrier, and we can get into that because tensions with China were building up, and they didn't want to signal. So part of it is, yeah, they've been playing on their own turf, but how good would they be if they had to confront a particular enemy? But Vietnam is very, very good, as I say, leveraging these strategic partnerships, and they're very good at telling countries what their interests are. Oh, the United States, we support your freedom of navigation as long as it's constructive for peace in the region. Please send your aircraft carriers. In the past, they used to do flyouts. That's many years ago, where officials would land on an American aircraft carrier and watch the operations as the aircraft carrier sailed through Vietnam's exclusive economic zone. They've pulled back from that in a way. But anytime there's a multilateral military exercise, particularly with ASEAN, Vietnam will join. And their Gepard frigates have gone to Japan, Korea, and for fleet reviews in India. And they've been down to Brunei, Indonesia, in Southeast Asia. So gradually testing the waters. But finally, the largest military exercises, the Rim of the Pacific, or RIMPAC, just concluded off Hawaii, did not see. The Vietnamese have only attended as observers, which means they don't send warships. And this year they didn't send observers, although Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and other countries in ASEAN did so. So circumspect would be how I put it. And as your question provided, building up self-reliance and doing it with countries, not necessarily the United States, which is too provocative, but to Japan and working with India along the way.
Okay, so I would like to move a little bit from the waters around Vietnam, and I know you've talked a lot about the islands that were fortified and militarized during the Obama administration, and it seems to me that actually the extent of the militarization is not really known to the wider public. Maybe we could talk about this a little bit because it seems like China has done a lot, and they have like huge airstrips, missiles, and radars, and they also get over their ships and they stay there for some time. So maybe we could talk about those huge islands that are really like unsinkable carriers in the sea.
Well, they are fortified islands, but the entire land area, when taken together, is quite small. But nonetheless, as you point out, China has militarized 7. And what do we mean? Well, 3 of them have airstrips over 3 kilometers long. And as one American admiral said, that lands everything except the space shuttle, but all large aircraft can land there. So we work out, they are forward operating bases that have been suited out with defensive missiles to protect itself, a close-in weapon support to hit, which are not missiles, which is a gun that fires lots of shells and puts it in the air, so a missile that's coming in would be hit. They have anti-aircraft missiles. They have missiles that could strike other islands. They build docks and piers. They can Coast Guard ships berth there. They have maritime militia, which are armed. But when I talk about militarizing the islands, militarization is a spectrum. And at one end, we can see uniformed people with sidearms on an island to protect it against piracy or to protect the fishermen that are there. At the other end of the spectrum are warfighting capabilities, kind of facilities I've just mentioned, but that become permanent, where you would add an amphibious assault ship, you would locate Marines, you would put aircraft in. So far as we know, the main users are the Chinese Coast Guard, Chinese militia, civilian transport ships. That there have been flights of military aircraft, but up until recently, no hard evidence that they're permanently based. So 12 to 24 planes of each type could be put on these three airstrips themselves. And of course, they could be used to attack Vietnamese held islands themselves. Big argument what would happen in a time of war. Greg Poling at the CSIS, the think tank in Washington, Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative, kind of argues that they could defend themselves and America couldn't use missiles from submarines because that would give away the submarine's position. We don't have to go down all that way. What they're serving for now is they can intimidate regional states with a presence. You can surge military forces, but China prefers, people call it gray zone tactics. I prefer gray zone operations, to use Coast Guard ships and maritime militia, which are not gray hulled warships, to make a particular its presence felt. And they can mass several hundred fishing boats and maritime militia, as they have in the Philippines, to squat in an area for that. But it means that we have to take a broader picture. China wants to unify with Taiwan. 95, 96, they had a crisis. China wasn't as big militarily. The United lobbed missiles into the ocean near Taiwan during the election, and America sent aircraft carriers. So now China is, these islands in the South China Sea guard the southern flank, guard Hainan Island, guard those approaches where the Americans might want to transit to Taiwan, as well as across the Pacific to Taiwan's east coast. And these are equipped with sufficient missiles so that they could create damage and U.S. warships at risk. I don't think there's any question of that. And we can leave the utility of whether these would survive in a war. I think they're not Ukraine facilities where you can go underground. They would be fragile, but they also could fire off. So, and also at an immediate crisis, you have to deal with the fact they're there and they have a presence, but not yet, as far as I was saying, on that spectrum of moving across to war fighting at the moment. And the absence of permanently based military jet aircraft, I think, is the indicator for that. But enough. Then I haven't mentioned all the kind of electronic and radar to create near perfect maritime domain awareness. Nothing above, on, or below the surface, theoretically, that's hostile to China can operate in the South China Sea without China being able to detect it. So that helps with targeting, and that puts risk in the minds of adversary commanders for China. And finally, some argue that all this would be complete if China occupied Scarborough Shoal in the Philippines, which it hasn't done. And that would create a strategic triangle of perfect maritime domain awareness. But nonetheless, China's there, they militarized, and it's generally seen as complete. There's not much more you can pack on to these artificial islands.
So it seems like for the time being, they just let it be there. So they don't really upgrade it now. It's like it's finished, and they just keep it to see for the future, right? For in a scenario when they would have to deal with the US, for example.
Right. Well, if you take I mentioned it kind of earlier when Vietnam stopped oil exploration, Malaysia hired foreign ships, and they continue to operate, and so does Indonesia. And the Philippines halted oil exploration. So what China does is it based Coast Guard ships on regular patrols. They only have to go back to an artificial island, not all the way back to the mainland or Hainan Island to replenish. So they can operate longer on station more
Okay.
quickly, and they can respond once they see an oil exploration vessel sailing in from Paris, or, from France, I mean, or from Spain to this area, to be able to harass it. So that's what it's used for.